Last week, I dropped a glass on the floor, and it shattered in every direction at once. The shards were beautiful in their own way, whereas before the glass reflected the soft yellow light from the overhead fixture, the shards refracted every color at once, the full spectrum glinting on the ground like multicolored gems. So I took out a dustpan and carefully swept the spot. I went over it twice and then got out the vacuum and slowly covered the area again. And then later that night, I got out of bed, and without thinking, I walked barefoot to the sink to get a drink of water, and I immediately regretted my decision. One of the splinters, one of those beautiful, multifaceted pieces of glass got lodged in my foot. And so at 2 a.m., I had to dig it out with a sewing needle, leaving drops of blood on the freshly swept kitchen floor. There is a meme that is floating around on Facebook, and several of my friends, some of them ministers, have shared it. And it says this: religion doesn't teach morality, it teaches obedience. Do this or be punished. True morality is about doing the right thing because it is right, not because you fear hell or want heaven. Now, I get this sentiment because some religions do insist on personal rewards in heaven and punishment for those who disobey. And I also get it because a sense of what is good and right doesn't need to come from religion. That can come from a deep personal conviction. And there are a lot of people who have that deep personal conviction apart from religion who have done amazing and courageous things. The author of the quote might be surprised, though, to learn that some theology makes the same argument that they do. Now, Gary Dorian, the great historian of theology, writes that this is actually the basic tenet of liberal theology and Unitarian Universalism in particular. These traditions take authority away from the Bible and the church, and they put it in the heart of the human being. People decide what is right and true, and then read the Bible or other sacred texts as inspiration or affirmation of their personal convictions. This is the opposite of biblical literalism. Literalism takes the word of the Bible as absolute truth. And so, for example, when it says that gay people should be stoned or women should remain silent, it doesn't matter how you feel about those things, you just have to accept them. The entire tradition of liberal theology is a rejection of that view. You first discover what is good and right, and then you discover religious writings that accord with your beliefs. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the famous German Lutheran pastor, theologian, and anti-Nazi dissenter, and spy, as we learned in our story today. He was immersed and trained in liberal theology. Liberal theology was the dominant movement in German seminaries in the 19th and 20th centuries. And Bonhoeffer was an intellectually gifted individual who earned his PhD at the age of, get this, 21. Now, you weren't allowed to be ordained until 25. And so he started working with children and youth. And if that isn't the definition of overqualified, then I'm not sure what is. But as Hitler rose to power, Bonhoeffer's faith and convictions led him to become an outspoken critic of the regime. He became involved in underground resistance efforts, and he formed an underground seminary, helped Jews across the borders, and even became entangled in plots to assassinate Hitler. All the while, he used his theological writings to call for a deeper, more authentic Christianity that refused passivity in the face of injustice. And what was deeply problematic for Bonhoeffer is that the German Protestant church fell in line so easily with the Nazis. When the Nazis demanded that the churches recite a statement of allegiance to Hitler in the middle of their service, very few opposed it. And what might be surprising, especially for those of us who are theologically liberal, myself included, is that most of these pastors were trained in liberal theology and they identified with it. And so in his writings from this period, Bonhoeffer diagnosed the problem as a theological one. He wrote that liberal theology basically looks to religion to amplify the human being's sense of what is good and right. But when the good and the right become distorted by prejudice and nationalism, religion then has very little to offer as a way of corrective. It becomes distorted and warped to justify a misguided sense of what is true and right. And so Bonhoeffer became increasingly disillusioned with liberal theology. He thought that the liberal churches were too quick to give in, to become passive, to fall apart in the face of opposition. And so he tried to think through an alternative, a different role for religion. And this is what he came to believe. A person's sense of what is good and right shouldn't necessarily be trusted, at least not automatically. And this is because a person's sense of what is good and right may be misguided and it may be self-serving. We humans are awfully good at coming up with excuses. Hitler's rise to power is a great example of that. Many people thought that parts of the Nazi agenda were problematic or unethical, and yet they chose to ignore those parts because they wanted to make Germany great again, because they wanted economic security or roles in the government or a sense of belonging to a greater political cause. Because of this, they fell in line. And then they insisted that what they were doing was right and good while ignoring the accelerating horrors in Germany. Bonhoeffer tried to imagine a different role for religion. Because so many found it easy to fall in line, religion shouldn't become a further excuse to do so, he believed. It shouldn't become a thing that supports our prejudices. He wasn't looking for a neat alignment between religion and our own sense of what was right and wrong. Rather, he wanted religion to be the hard thing, the thing that demands too much. Our obedience to it, he wrote, should call for our suffering in some cases. We have to learn, he wrote, that personal suffering is a more effective key, a more rewarding principle for exploring the world in thought and action than is personal good fortune. And there were several guides, several keys, he thought, in the scriptures that call on us to do the hard thing, the thing that disrupts and unsettles our justifications for self-serving behavior. Now, I love this quote from the Gospel of Luke, and Bonhoeffer did too. And then Jesus said to his host, when you give a luncheon or dinner, do not invite your friends, your brothers or sisters, your relatives, or your rich neighbors. If you do, they might invite you back, and you will be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and then you will be blessed. Although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid by the resurrection of the righteous. And then the Sermon on the Mount, the sermon that includes the Beatitudes that Will lifted up in the prayer today, it offers sharper challenges. These are called the woes of Jesus. Woe unto you who are rich, for you have already received your comfort. Woe unto you who are well fed now, for you will go hungry. Woe to you who laugh now in the face of horror, for you will mourn and weep. You cannot read these passages and justify racism. You cannot read these passages and justify the hoarding of wealth and resources. You cannot read these and justify a border wall or support for authoritarian regimes or dehumanizing groups of people, such as trans people. Sometimes we find ourselves on the side of the oppressed when we read these, and sometimes we find ourselves with too much wealth and power when we read these. But either way, we can be challenged and opened by their demand. Obedience to these words call on us to challenge our own self-interest and side with those who are on the margins. Here we learn, as Bonhoeffer says, to see the great events of world history from below, from the perspective of the outcast, the suspects, the maltreated, the powerless, the oppressed, the reviled, in short, from the perspective of those who suffer. This, he thinks, is the antidote to the selfishness and distortions that we humans can get so good at. And here's the thing, and here's where I depart somewhat from Bonhoeffer. I don't think that you need to come by these only through the teachings of Jesus. Primo Levi, in the reading that Susan did this morning, finds it in his own tradition of Judaism. The Buddha and Muhammad speak hard truths. We can be called and called out by many of the great religious teachers. We just have to learn how to listen. So back to the Facebook meme. It says that true morality has nothing to do with religion because religion is self-serving. Religion, the quote says, is all about getting into heaven. True morality is about following your own sense of what's right and good. The problem, as I see it, and as Bonhoeffer sees it, is that we humans are awfully good at deceiving ourselves. We convince ourselves that something is good and true when it's not. We let self-interest and comfort get in the way of doing what's right, and then we convince ourselves that that's okay, that we are still doing what's good and what's right. The best parts of religion, the parts that we need to lift up and look at, are teachings that disrupt this tendency, that disrupt us, that challenge us and unravel easy excuses, that shake our prejudice and our role in systems of inequality and oppression, that speak to leaders who would be inaugurated and then abuse their power, that speak woe to us who sit idly by and do nothing. This form of religion, this part of religion, this difficult part of religion, it is beautiful and it is terrible. It is sometimes painful, it sometimes demands our suffering, but it can also give us deep insight into what is truly good and true in ways that we might not otherwise have seen. It can demand that we stand with the poor and those on the margins and those who are being targeted by cruel politics. It can be the splinter of glass that when you hold it up to the light, it refracts every color at once, and then it wakes you at 2 a.m., the pain, unique, exquisite, and punishing. What hard thing are we being called to do during these troubling times? What are the actions that we are being called to take? What can challenge us and jar us out of our complacency? Those aren't questions that I can neatly answer today. I don't think they're questions that any of us can neatly answer today. They are questions that we have to ask ourselves again and again and again. And we will know that we are on the right track, Bonhoeffer says, when we constantly find new ways to make room for the other. May we constantly find those ways to make room for the other. Amen. I love you, and may it be so.